John Stuart Mill, but I think with Marx, it was the end of the classical theory, the classical approach. And we saw the beginning around 1870 of an approach which was thought to be a response to the threat that the classical approach was perceived to have, insofar as they clearly indicate that capitalism implies class struggle, that there is antagonism between workers and capital. Then, of course, Marx brought in the idea that capitalism might be at the end stage, and then there is some revolutionary possibility around the corner. And so I think that this was perceived to be threatening as a way of dealing with economics and economic theory. This is one explanation why we have this shift, this switch point, in which now this approach has been challenged and the new approach was born. So what happens around 1870, because we take this year when 3 books appear with the similar content, and they are both identifiable as abandoning the Ricardian. When I mean Ricardian, I said the classical approach, that we have discussed yesterday, and there was a shift towards a theory and towards a way of looking at the capital system based on different concepts. And the 2 concepts which were completely new is a theory of value based on subjectivity. So the theory of value is based not on objective factors such as labor or production and so forth. It's based on subjectivity, and the basic notion become the marginal utility. For all the economists here, I imagine that the first lecture you're given, you maximize utility. Somebody is maximizing utility, right? For non-economists, which gladly have not been exposed to this, is the idea that you can explain economic behavior on the basis of the idea that everybody is a maximizer of something that you don't observe, namely utility, but is there. And this is the basis of your choice behavior, okay? So people are utility maximizer, and they make choices on the basis of the subjective evaluation rather than on the basis, value so is based on subjective evaluation rather than objective factor, as in the classical theory. Remember, for the classical, value is labor, mainly, okay? Here, value has to do with utility, has to do with something which is a subjective evaluation. So who are these people who made that so-called revolution? You see, the thing is that they published mostly at the same time, around 1870, a book which share the same views in terms of value, utility, and so on. So these people are Karl Menger, from the Austrian tradition, the Austrian school. Then we have Jevons from the British tradition, and then we have from the French Lausanne school, Varras. So these people publish a book most of the same time, in which they say, no, the Ricardian approach and has its problems. We need to build a theory based on different assumptions, on different concepts, and they were successful because in the end, these are the kind of economics that evolve into what kind of economics we do now. No, we don't do classical theory. We don't do that. Okay, you might have an occasional course in some of these ideas, but economics is what has been founded here. This is what economics is now, what we understand by mainstream economics. So we have these 3 books who came out almost at the same time. Principle of Pure Economics by Menger, The Theory of Political Economy by Jevons, and various elements of pure economics. Okay? So, why do we call it a marginal revolution? Okay, first of all, the word revolution implies that there is an overhaul of what has happening before. There's been a completely change, and this was really a revolution in the sense that now economics was based on different assumptions. What about marginal? Marginal is the mechanism by which choice is made. You remember, for those who have done economics, we always talk marginal productivity, marginal utility, and so on. It's the idea of the reason of the margin, over which we will spend a lot of time when we will criticize this later on. But for the time being, let's assume that marginal means the first derivative. Okay, is the rate of change of something, assuming that you have very little incremental variation in the quantity that you analyze, be it production and then it is used to solve a maximization problem. Okay, so since economic problem become a maximization problem, so you have a constraint, and then you find the optimum solution. And that's mean by finding the first derivative of the function you are analyzing, okay? So it becomes very technical, but conceptually is the solution of an equation in which you have either utility or wages or whatever, and you find the maximum solution of that function given the constraint. If you are a consumer, the constraint is your income, your budget. If you are a producer, the constraint would be your costs. But it's basically the same exercise. The idea is that you have resources which are given and are scarce, and you find the optimal utilization of those resources by finding the optimum solution to that particular function. That is all about this, okay? So you always find a solution to a maximizing problem, okay? And so value becomes, so you maximize in what? The utility to you of that particular good, which is the basis upon which you will build your demand curve. And so value become the subjective value or subjective or utility that you give that particular commodity or that particular good. And that's the basis upon which then choice will be made. For those who are economists, may I remind you that you have these indifferent curves. Mainly, you have two goods, and you derive a curve that give you the same satisfaction along this indifference curve of these two goods. And then you find the tangency point of this indifference curve with the budget line. Okay, this for non-economists means that you rate a couple of commodities on the basis of how well both give you the same type of satisfaction. And then you have your budget, and then you try to get as much as possible of these two commodities given your budget, okay? So that's said a little bit crude for people who have not done economics. But for people who've done economics, I just remember the exercise is to be on the highest in different curves given the budget constraint, okay? But as you can see, it's just the choice of the optimum solution to that particular type of problem. You can see how far we are from the way in which the classical economists envisage value and so forth. Here is the individual, the consumer, who's confronted with choices, and he's just making a decision of the basis of the kind of satisfaction that is assumed to get from these commodities given his budget. Same thing for the producer. The producer has factors of production, capital and labor. Yes, an iso-cost curve, meaning a combination of labor and capital that would make him stay on the same cost curve. And given the prices of these inputs, he make the decision of what minimize cost, which is you maximize utility on the one hand and you minimize cost on the other, but it's the same type of exercise. You find the optimum solution to a function, basically. Okay, is that clear? Any question, any clarification on that? Okay. So when you have this apparatus, how would you determine wages and profit and distribution? Well, it's the same exercise than finding the optimum solution. You have to equate the margin, the increase in utility that you get by buying that particular good with the price that good has on the market, and you try to be maximizing the best that you can given your income. So prices and distribution becomes determined by the same principle, by the solution to an optimization problem. And so when you've done that, everything is neat, everything gives the idea that everything is connected together, and that's the way in which economics is still done nowadays. So what is central in this exercise, but if you are familiar with a little bit of calculus, as I said, marginal means the first derivative, basically. So you reason at the margin means find the optimum solution by having solved this very simple calculus. The problem is that while in calculus you can allow for infinitesimal magnitudes, in economics, what does it mean, infinitesimal magnitudes? Infinitesimal change in that quantity doesn't make much sense, does it? Anyway, that's how it's done. Because basically, what we said yesterday, when you translate everything in mathematics, mathematics takes over. Because if you have to maximize a function, you're not looking at what the function really is in terms of actual goods and commodity. You're just treating it as a function, okay? And in order to do so, you have to accept some simplification in the analysis, which in the end will take you developing a lot of maths, forgetting that this math is covering up rather than revealing things. Because when you assume that you can change things at the margin, if you think in economics, you can think in unit. What happens if I increase of 1 unit of one commodity? But thinking at the margin as an infinitesimal change means that maths is taking over, because in order to do so, you have to apply a method which require infinitesimal changes, not finite changes. Okay, okay. So again, for economists, you know that from this indifferent curves and budget line at the optimum point, then you can derive a demand curve that relates the quantity to the price. Okay, and along the demand curve, which is down sloping, there are all these optimum points of choice between indifferent curves and budget line. Supply curve is the same. These are all optimum cost minimizing points. And so along these supply curves, you have all these optimum points that will be chosen by the producer because they are cost minimizing points. On the demand side, they are all points that will be chosen because they are all utility maximizing point, or it's called. So when you have this demand and supply you have the tools that allow you to determine prices. So to determine the equilibrium prices, and So if the supply and demand curves are well behaved, namely they are downward sloping and so forth, you can show that the system will converge at equilibrium. Okay, so if you are in a price which is higher than equilibrium prices, there will be forces that push you back to the equilibrium point and so forth. So price adjustment are supposed to exist so that you get to an equilibrium, which is a resting point for the economy. Namely, you are there, and unless there is some movement in this, you will remain in that resting point, which is called equilibrium. Okay? So this is something interesting because, of course, the classical economists were looking for a resting point of a system, because the resting point of a system means that you understand and you are able to describe the forces that govern the system. But the word equilibrium as such is very much linked to the idea of demand and supply as being the determinant of equilibrium. In the classical economics, we had, say, normal prices, so prices that tend to remain persistent, but we don't have this notion of equilibrium because we don't have demand and supply functions. We have demand and supply quantity. Remember what I said about when the king died and white clothes and so forth. So in the end, we want to describe a situation which is defined as average as normal. And the mechanism by which this in the classical theory is reached by having capital moving from one sector to another so that the rate of profit is equalized around the system. But we don't have movement around curve of supply and demand, which is what characterizes the neoclassical theory. So when we have this principle, a distribution becomes just a pricing exercise. You find wages are determined by supply and demand of labor, profit, supply and demand of capital, rent, supply and demand of land. So distribution, as you can see, each distributed share is determined independently. So you don't see antagonism between profit and wages any longer. In the classical theory, profit can go up only if wages go down and vice versa. So you can see the antagonism in distribution inbuilt in the theory. Here, wages are separately determined, profit are separately determined, so you don't see any antagonism over there. And the idea is just market determined. If wages are low, it means that there is more supply than demand. There's nothing, okay. There's nothing there that let you see the antagonism, which is in the nature of the capitalist system, of course. And that completely disappears. So rather than labor, now we have value based on subjective magnitude at the basis of the theory of production, the theory of distribution. And you can see this is completely changed on the kind of approach that I have described yesterday as being typical of the classical. So there is a symmetry which is introduced among the classes. The idea is that people get what they contribute. Remember, let's talk about wages, or capital. So remuneration of factor is just the payment of the service that they do in production, okay? So there is this symmetry. Since labor contributed as such, then that's why wages are paid. Since capital contributed as such, profit is paid. So the idea is that distribution has to do with remuneration of contributions to the production system. And so there is a lot of symmetry in the analysis. The wages are not treated different from profit in this respect. They are all treated on the same basis. So marginal utility and marginal productivity are the basis for the construction of demand and supply curves. And this mathematization of the analysis help us to give it a sense of scientific. The classical Vercetti, they're talking all over the place. Here we have a scientific basis because we have all this function. Then we can manipulate. You can make this function very mathematically sophisticated if you want, but I don't think that conceptually there's much different. They are basically all the same. It's the same whole idea. You maximize something under constraint, and that's the whole exercise. So the focus is becoming allocation of given resources rather than the analysis of the reproduction system, which was typical of the classical analysis, and the whole outlook of economics become an outlook which completely devoid from society, completely devoid. Everything is based what individual, be it producer or consumer, decision making is, and that's the basis of what economics is all about, right? So the forces of supply and demand, which I show you determine both price and distribution, are based on economic decision. There is no other rules in economics. We are in a market economy. People make decisions on the basis of their endowment and on the basis of their preferences and on the basis of their income. And this free decision mechanism is assumed to produce the best possible result. Okay? No classes, no conflict. Everything is completely determined by individual choices. The individual is at the center of the decision mechanism, and whatever the results are, these are determined by market decision. Nobody is forcing anyone to do anything. And if this is the result, it means that this is the outcome of what individuals have decided, okay? And the idea that it was believed coming from Adam Smith, but I think I explained to you that this is very partial. The idea that this is just because what is economics? Economics is the rational pursuit of self-interest. I'm sure for all of those of you who have done economics, the first paragraph tells you that what is economics is the use of alternative uses of resources based on individual maximizing agent. If individuals are other than maximize agent, let's have the sociologists bother about it, or we economists, we are just looking at economic decision by individual who are rational maximizing agent. Okay, all the rest is just stuff that economists are not concerned. Let the sociologist or the political scientists worry about this. We don't. Okay.
But isn't it the whole idea of capital economy is the common good in that way, where the common good is based on the self-interest, like if like so.
Well,
I mean, how isn't it a paradox in that way?
Well, it is paradox to think that everybody is placed on the same footing in making decisions, that constraints are the same in which class, race, gender, doesn't matter. You just reduce an individual as if he had the same set of choices, which is not obviously the case. So this mythical individual, which is at the basis of decision making, does not exist. It's a homo economicus. Is someone is assumed to exist because economics is assumed to be doing just the exercise of finding what is the optimum solution to a problem of maximization. You're not asking yourself, am I situated in the same position? Think of gender, or in case of India, caste, or in terms, are people on the same footing when they make decisions? Do they have the same set of preference given to them? Are they actually, quote unquote, free to make that decision making? That's what is being disputed, I think. That this kind of representing economic choice is reducing economics to a small exercise to produce the fantasy that by letting everyone pursue their own self-interest, the system get the best possible solution given the constraint. This way of thinking that I believe makes economic less interesting than it should be, because we should be talking about real problems, real people. People make decisions. We should be addressing this issue without this fantasy that there is this homo economicus rational agent that maximizes something. Is that okay? Okay, all right. Okay, so production and consumption are independent, balancing forces, and they are both equally used to determine value. So what is really important is the change also in the notion of cost, from objective to subjective consideration. Everything become, you see, it has been said that, we took in an area in which advertising was booming, was the first in which consumers were, especially in the United States, were given a particular centrality at the end of the 20th century. So what they say, well, these classical economists with this class business, they don't see that the society is evolving, is a consumer society, it's consumer who make decisions and so on. So they were somehow alluring, the public with the idea that we need to put consumer at the center of the analysis, because this is what is happening. And consumer are those who are making decisions, those who are, the ones who produce and look at in order to make decision what to produce and what not. So this centrality of the consumer became also seen as the outcome of what was changing in the capitalist system, in which the consumer society was emerging, and therefore they seems to be addressing precisely a point that the classical economists had not addressed. This is one reason. The other reason is that it was felt that it was not fair to see capitalism as just a class conflict case. Capitalism was seen also to be progressive, to give answers to many issues that were unsolved, poverty, education. And so this is, the market society, the American dream, you give opportunity to everybody. So this theory seems to fuel the idea that capitalism was not all this destruction, antagonism, class struggle. It was just also a system that would allow people to rise in society and to get something that they would not have had in the earlier system. So this theory served the purpose also to justify what was happening in the world. And it's nowadays with neoliberal theory, they try to persuade you that neoliberalism is produced so many good things, because it freed people of many constraints that they had in the past. So economic theories has always played this role, either reflecting what was going on in the society in a particular time, but also the apologetic role of justifying what was going on. So it has both this function, and that was particularly true at the origin of the marginal revolution. So what are the methodological implications of this change in approach? The methodological implication is that now we see the system as gravitating towards equilibrium. The capitalist system is not seen as a system that a lot of turbulence, that a lot of crisis, that there is a lot of change. Yes, everything is, if you let everybody pursue their own interests, if you let the market work without interference, without messing about with the market, then the system will work smoothly towards equilibrium solution. Okay? And so this gives you an idea that the capitalist system is stable. Is stable, is producing an outcome, an equilibrium outcome, we tend to persist if undisturbed. That's where the old liberal system developed. You know, the new liberalism is slightly different, but the idea is that let the market make their job. Markets can work very efficiently if you don't mess around with them, if you don't interfere. The force of demand and supply will work their way through and get you to the equilibrium point, and this equilibrium will be stable, okay? And this equilibrium obviously is brought about by this demand and supply, which are supposed to be doing their job of getting you, of smoothing out any imbalances that might occur if you don't mess around with them. For instance, if you put a cap on prices, then you will have some misadjustment in quantity. Because if you let prices fluctuate, then demand and supply will find the right balance. And this is the basis of the equilibrium condition. What is the problem with this? Well, you don't observe demand and supply. Okay, you assume they exist. Okay, so rather than starting from observed variable, as the classical did, and try to describe a movement that this variable would do, but we're talking about things that you observe, okay? Observable. Here you have theoretical stipulation, theoretical assumption, marginal. Have you ever seen a marginal magnitude? You can't see that, right? Have you ever seen a demand curve? Demand curve is always what if. So it's basically an hypothetical conjecture, right? What would be the quantity demanding if the price is such and such? You don't observe all this variation. You don't observe what happens in fact, no? Because you can observe only one price and one quantity, okay? In the next period, you will observe another price, another quantity, but something else might have happened in the between. How do you know you are in the same demand curve? You don't know. Because you cannot observe alternative combination of price and quantity at the same time. You can just have one observation, right? So this is our hypothetical changes. By the way, all this analysis has been done in a fantastic, perfect way by an Indian woman economist, Krishna Bharadwaj, who was a professor at GNU, and she wrote a fantastic piece on showing which kind of change in hypothetical construction are behind demand and supply curves, and explain why, you know, they are not to be taken too seriously when it comes to price and distribution determination. Okay, is that clear? The idea that, you know, a demand curve tells you what if, is a what if type of thing. And again, if you have a very nice function, well, the function needs to be differentiable, and it has to have the mathematical property to do so, okay? And that's where the emphasis shift on the mathematical property rather than on the economic content that is implied in this exercise, okay? And then there is this symmetry between production and consumption. They are on the same level. And what I would like to insist is this notion of change that in the classical economies is actual change happening in reality. Here we're talking about the virtual exercise that are implied in this notion of change. What happens if? It's not showing a real change, it's showing a potential of that change, okay? I don't know whether that, because it's a difficult thing to gather. So when you say, if the price is 10, then the quantity demanded is 12. And then when you say, when the price changes to, this word changes seems to imply that you observe, that you see an actual change in price. You don't see that. You postulated that this change happens, what in reality is just a virtual change. You know, when you say, if prices goes from this to that, you're not talking about an actual change in reality. I was once a student in California. I cannot tell you how many years ago because you will spot my age. You will anyway, but anyway, it was many, many years ago. And my professor was Professor Axel Leijonwood, who was a very famous Keynesian economist. And he was telling us the story that when he was teaching first-year student, he taught them demand. And he said, you know, if the price changes, then the quantity demand and so on. And so apparently next day, bunch of 2-3 students came around and said, oh no, professor, we went to the supermarket and we stayed and watch and watch and watch. And we watched what happens to, I think it was a cask of beer or something. And the cask of beer disappeared. The prices did not change. You know, the price remained the same. And we watch all the afternoon. You know, so you're teaching something wrong because the price did not change. So I thought that was a marvelous story. Because the idea is that you don't say, you're not talking about change in the sense that you assume change. You know, if the quantity move, you move. We're talking about virtual exercise in which you said, I have to postulate because why can I do that? Because I assume that this demand curve exists. How do I assume that this demand curve exists? Because they are point of maximization of individuals. So you see, it's all a construction that is made up in order for you to make some kind of postulation that this equilibrium will exist. But in fact, you're not making the experiment. You're just postulated as a mathematical function. In mathematics, there's no time, right? It's like geometry. You know, when you said I move from this, from there, you're not moving in the sense that we say when we move in reality. There's no time. Is a relationship. Is a relationship which is postulated by the theory. Okay. So in order though to get to this equilibrium, you have to assume that change happens in reality. No, you have to assume that the economic system moves along these curves. And, you know, people have said, well, but we observe that prices may be stable. We observe that the economic system is working. So there might be some truth in the theory we are presenting, because in reality, we observe some stability in the system. We observe that in the end, of course, if the supply of something drastically reduced, the price will fall. But that's also the classical economists would say that. We are not denying that there is a relationship between prices and quantity. The point is that how is the relationship functional to the theory in order to get a particular definition of equilibrium, of distribution, and so forth. I want to make sure that you don't think that I disbelieve the idea that there is a relationship between prices and quantity. What I dispute that this relationship should be represented in such a way, because the purpose of doing this is the purpose to show that there is some equilibrating forces within the system, which are the result of an optimum solution. So the capitalism is producing an optimum solution of the given resources. Is that clear? Okay. So I think that, and that's what Krishna insisted very much. And she said, well, the difference between the two systems, classical and neoclassical, is a classical system with all its limitations and so forth, is based on observable things. When you read the classical economy, you can see reality through their pages. You can see, you know, classes, you can see workers. When you read through these people, you don't see reality. You see all these imagined situations which are introduced in order to explain reality, but you don't see the observational part is very much reduced. You don't observe utility, you don't observe the homo economicus, you don't observe all these people, okay? So while in the classical economies, for instance, price of production are something that you observe in a single instances, the equilibrium theory of the neoclassical theory are property that are theoretically postulated. They are potential magnitude, hypothetical things that are used to explain the working of the system. And so this aspect, and we will discuss this when we talk about Sraffa, that the hallmark of scientific activity is when you're dealing with property of a system of magnitude, which are observable, which are measurable. That's what science is about. And so the idea that the neoclassical economics is more scientific because it has more maths may be the opposite. It has enough math, but it doesn't have enough observable, measurable quantities they deal with. And so this might make it less scientific, not more scientific than it is, okay? So that's something I took from Krishna. She said, a statement about one position at equilibrium is tied up with a theory specifying the exact terms, the behavior of the system under change away from that position. So you have to know exactly the path. It's like you be in a tram line. You know, you're always in a tram line. Namely, if you're out, you get immediately in because you always move around along these curves. It's like having tram line tracks. You know, the system is always following a predetermined path. And whenever you get out of it, you can get into it. And so this is a very, very strong assumption. Think about how the classical economists of Marx thought of capitalism as a system in which a lot of disruption is going on, and there is no certainty how the path, where is the path that will get you anywhere, no? So this is another type of, and so I think that the difference with the classical economies is that the notion of change is anchored to observe variable. It doesn't have a predetermined path. Is much more akin to what we observe in reality, turbulence and so forth. While in the neoclassical theory, there is the idea that if something wrong happens, it's because you have interfered, it's because you don't have let the market do their job. But potentially, the system has the property of letting you converge towards equilibrium. Okay? So I think I would like to stop here now and have a bit of a discussion before getting to because this is sort of difficult stuff in a way. Shall we pick up a few comments, even from yesterday, if you want to clarify something, okay? I would like to give a little bit time to discussion now. Come on, you must have something that bothers you. Let me get closer because I'm getting old and deaf.
Okay. So my question is, in the demand and supply analysis,
Yes.
We are concerned with prices. So how the price is determined in the market? Okay.
How
the price is determined by this demand and supply analysis.
prices are determined by the intersection between the supply and demand.
So this is not the question, ma'am. So
yeah.
So my question is, how the first price came into the market?
How
Price came into the market, and because of the first price, by setting the benchmark, and then determining the prices in the market after that. You understand?
I'm not sure I got you.
Ma'am, my question is,
can you speak slowly a little bit?
okay.
You seem to speak very fast.
Okay.
Yes, we have time. So we have time.
So in the demand and supply analysis,
Yes.
we are trying to determine the prices in the market.
Okay.
Okay. So my question is, how we determine the first price? First price. So we are here setting the model based on the first price is given. So my criticism is how
There is
we.
no first price. You assume you are in a marketplace, okay?
Okay.
You have people bringing things to the market, and they are consumer who are demanding this. Suppose somebody cries out the first price,
Yeah.
okay? And the first price is wrong, mainly.
Okay.
We are asking too much because there are not so many consumers that are willing to pay that particular price, okay? So whatever is crying out the price, think of the fish market or any other type of market. And that's in fact what the neoclassical, they take the fish market or the stock exchange market, okay? So somebody's crying out the price, and you observe that, or auction price, they observe at that particular price, no one is willing to buy that quantity. So he starts decreasing the price until he gets to a point in which people agreed to buy that. The thing is that a capitalist system is not a fish market.
Yeah.
That's the problem. You take that as an example of the way in which, first of all, there is no one crying a price around. Have you ever seen someone saying, obviously, prices are determined by production. It's the producer who decide what the price of this smartphone is, and then if you realize that this price is too high, they might make an adjustment. It depends on the market form. If it is the only producer in that market, he can disregard anything, but his competitors do a reduction in price, he has to react. So the thing is much more complicated in price determination than this idea that there is a market in which somebody cries out the price and the mechanism. Did I answer to your question? Yes, good. Somebody else? Oh yeah, we have somebody from. Yes?
Right. First, I want to appreciate your lectures. They have been very, very enlightening. I'm Adefemi Sumona. I'm speaking from Nigeria. I'm a political scientist. I've enjoyed your lectures since yesterday.
Thank you.
And yes. My very simple question, even though I've noted from your delivery several differences between classical economics and neoclassical economics, is that would you please help us summarize the differences again?
Yes.
Between classical economics and neoclassical economics?
Yes. Okay. I mean, there are obvious many differences, and not all the authors are the same. So we are making some simplification when we say all the neoclassical from one side and all the classical on the other side, because we're talking of different authors. But there are certain common features that allow us to say classical author, they all share the same views, and neoclassical authors share similar view. But there are differences, of course, among them. But simplifying matter a lot, I would say, first of all, distribution, okay? Distribution in classical theory is determined by different laws than prices. Prices are determined according to the rules of the equalization of the rate of profit that would move capital from one sector to another, so that no one can get more with the same amount of capital. And prices adjust in such a way that in the long run, they are determined by the cost of production and the equalization of the rate of profit. So while in the neoclassical economics, prices and distribution are determined by the same law, and the law is supply and demand. And the law of supply and demand implies that distribution and prices are determined in the same way. What are the implications of this argument? While in neoclassical economics, distribution is not seen as antagonistic, because the wages and profit are determined independently. There's no antagonism between the two. Everybody gets what is rewarded according to their contribution to the production, for instance. In classical economics, distribution is seen as antagonist, because you remember, you take out from the surplus the necessary consumption for workers, and obviously the two things are antagonistic. If wages goes up, then profit has to go down. Okay, so the first implication of this is that while you have a vision of society as having conflicting interests, which are worked out in distribution, in neoclassical economics, you don't have that. And then that, I think, is the most important thing, the independence of distribution from price determination. But then you can add other things like classical authors were not so obsessed with the idea the economics is about maximizing utility or pursuing self-interest. There's not so much emphasis on individuals and so forth. There are many other things, but I would say that the independence of distribution and prices and the law of supply and demand is the most important one. Did I answer your question?
Perfectly. Thank you very much. I appreciate
it. Thank you. Okay. Any other question, or shall we move on? Okay, so let's move on. So now I want to talk about this man, Alfred Marshall, who is in between the classical and the neoclassical theory. He was a neoclassical author, but he had took an interest in classical theory, and he wanted to show continuity. The reason why we will discuss him, first of all, because he was the most important economist in the 1920s, 1910s, around the world, but especially in England and Cambridge. Cambridge was the center of the world, obviously, and the empire and so forth. So he had a great influence on the way in which economics was taught, and it was very influential. So this is the first reason. The other two reasons is that he tried to show continuity. So somehow he managed to see, well, there is not so much difference between classical and neoclassical economics. Why do we want to make it? Let's see as a continuity. In doing so, he watered down a lot the classical economics to show that it is compatible with classical and neoclassical. They are compatible. And the other reason is because he was somebody who had a great influence on the next two big names that we will address him, namely Piero Sraffa and John Maynard Keynes. Okay, and so these are the three reasons, or the two reasons, why I want to discuss him. First of all, because he was the most influential economist throughout the first quarter of the 20th century, and secondly, because he was the target and he was very much at the center of the relationship with what I consider the two most important economists of the last century, namely Piero Sraffa and John Maynard Keynes, on the critical side. No, there are other very important economists, but here I'm concerned to give you the ones who were critical and okay. So Marshall, okay. So Marshall wrote this principle of economics. They ran 8 editions. It's like Samuelson nowadays. Everybody read Marshall, 8 edition. It was taught everywhere, and so he is an important guy. If you start the principle, like if you open up Samuelson, he tells you what are the main important things to do economics. Okay, so he said things are wanted and therefore are produced. These products are sold in the market at an exchange value determined by supply and demand. And this market value is distributed as income to those who help to produce it, that is, the labor owners, capital, and entrepreneur. So he set up the scene in a way that is very similar to neoclassical economics, but he does it in a way which seems to be perfectly acceptable. You know, you don't, if you read this, you say, yes, do I have anything wrong to say about this? No. Because it's said in such a way that it doesn't seem to implicate any big change in what economics it was supposed to be. And so he said economics is the science of wealth and part of the science of man. So you see, here is bringing in something that we said Adam Smith was also concerned. Say, okay, we want to describe economics as being dealing with what makes wealth of nation or wealth of people, but it's also the science of man. So we have to understand motives, we have to understand inclinations, we have to understand incentives. So it's bringing in again into the analysis, the observation that economics is also about understanding what motivates people, what makes people behave the way in which they are, and how we use this understanding to set up incentive to modify behavior or to reach certain particular goals. Marshall was very much concerned with welfare people. He was very much worried about the level of poverty that the Industrial Revolution had brought to India. He used to visit the slums, and he said, you know, economics need to be done in order to serve for the good of the people. We should not do it if we don't have in mind this. So in a sense, he was one of the first really concerned with welfare economics, like his successor, Pigou, you might have heard of him. So there were people that think that economics was for the common good. And so he was trained as a mathematician, okay? And he said, yes, I want to keep mathematics into the footnotes. I don't want mathematics to take over, as it were, because I want to discuss it in a way that is understood on its own term, not because it's elegantly mathematic. It was not because he didn't know mathematics. He was a trained mathematician. But he thought that if we put too much mathematics into economics, then you would obscure the argument, okay? The other thing that is interesting about about Marshall, is being a mathematician and so on, he was not so obsessed with the idea that we have to try to make economics look as much as possible as a physical science, because he said economics is more complex, is more difficult. We cannot reduce the economics law to physical laws because human beings are much more complicated. And there is a nice story about Keynes having dinner close to Max Planck, one of the greatest scientists, and very complicated physical scientist. And so Keynes asked, have you ever considered studying economics? He said, no, it's too difficult. So the idea is that economics is too difficult because you're dealing with human propensity, inclination, again, Adam Smith, and so if you try to reduce everything to physical science, you making a big mistake. And that's what Marshall himself said. Economics law are more complex and less advanced of those of physical science. So we have to have a combination of analysis. You have to know history, you have to know many things about society in order to develop a good theory. So you have to have two things: theoretical foundation, of course, but then you have to have historical knowledge. And this is again like Smith. Smith has, if you read The Wealth of Nations, there are a lot of historical examples. They both thought, Marshall and Smith, that the laboratory to understand economics is past economic events, past history. So Adam Smith spent a lot of time studying the American colonies. Marshall spent a lot of time understanding factories. He would go around and see how factories work. So they were both economists that have profound sense that economics need to be rooted in the knowledge and understanding of facts and historical situation. And then the other thing that he thought is very important are institutions. He had not in mind the market of the Homo economicus. He had in mind actual people. So he talks about merchants, bankers, manufacturers. Those people have a distinctive character, the way in which they behave, the way in which they work. And so we need to identify these characters as part of our understanding of society. And also institutions are important. Which type of government are there? Do you have democracy? Do you have any kind of oligarchy? What is the banking system like? So he gets very much involved in the understanding how institutions work. And I think this is another aspect that makes Marshall very, very interesting. And then from a theoretical point of view, unlike the mathematician, he thought in economics, we have to look to deal with time. How time influences the operation of market forces. If you stay tied to demand and supply curve, you forget about time, as I said. You know, you're just moving on a virtual space, on a virtual time. Instead, in economics, time matters. It takes time to have the production finished. It takes time to make a decision whether should I build or not build a plant. Everything requires time. If you put the wine into the bottles, it takes 2 years to get ready for the market, and therefore the rate of friction. So he is very much concerned, how do we deal with time in economics? And dealing with time is not having a differential equations, right? It's not by having heavy mathematics. It's not that dynamics here in mind. Dynamics mean how is time affecting, influencing really the working of the market forces. So he said we have to take lesson from history and biology, not just from mathematics, in order to understand the system. He was very much influenced by what was going on at the time in biology, Darwin and Spencer. And so he was very much interested to show that maybe society has a similar development like in biology. You know, people, sperm, for instance, they are born, they grow, and then they die. He had a famous examples when he said from clocks to clocks, namely the first generation of entrepreneur, when they were clocks, they were poor, and they put a lot of energy to build up something. And then the second generation, that was much more refined and fortified, and the firm becomes very important. And then the third generation that was raised in luxury and become poor again. And so he said that there is an evolution within the working of the entrepreneurial system, which might be analogous to the evolution of species. So he had this idea that we can use biology to understand of how the system evolved, they grow, how they died, and so forth. He was very much influenced by this idea of an evolution, something that, and then of course, the second element that was important, and to try to understand in history how things were done, and how, most important of everything, what are the motivation of human actions? Not just self-interest, but you have to understand motivation, how the minds of people work, what is behind decision-making, what is, we have to find a way to express the motivation in a way that are dealt with in economics. We have to make them somehow represented in terms that can be usable in economics analysis. And so that's where he comes up with the idea that we can translate motivation also in terms of cost, incentive, and advantages in money terms. But behind this is the idea, let's not just talk self-interest, let's talk to different kind of motivation that can be activated through the economic mechanism. And through incentive, maybe we can change society a little bit. That's something that will come out also in Keynes, okay? So I just wonder whether you want to have a break now or you want to wait. Shall we have a break now, or tell me? We have a break now? 10 minutes? Okay. So we get into. That's good to have a break. All right. economic is a bunch of rubbish. I just want to give a fair treatment to some author who, although they were neoclassical, they are intellectually challenging and intellectually interesting. Because otherwise, you become, this is the bad guys and these are the good guys. No, I mean, the history of economic thought should teach you to respect intellectual achievement when there is achievement, when you get a little bit annoyed, when it becomes too much apologetic, when it becomes a little bit too much like neoliberalism, but when things gets a little bit too much in terms of defending the existing system. But when you have people who are intellectually engaged in describing reality and so forth, like Marshall was, I think they need to be respected and their theory needs to be studied because you can get important things out of it. As a matter of fact, you will see that people like Marshall, like Keynes and Rafa, they kept having Marshall as a very valuable interlocutor. You don't want to convince people who think like you. You want to convince people who do not think like you. And so in order to do that, you have to know what other people think. It's no good to repeating, among yourself things that you already believe. You have to be able to come up with convincing argument, and to come up with convincing argument, you have to know what other people think and how, economists and so on. So why Marshall is important? Well, because he made some methodological breakthrough in the analysis. Some of them remain accepted also in the critical tradition. One is the so-called partial equilibrium analysis. What is partial equilibrium analysis? It's the idea that you break complex problem in various causal parts by the famous assumption of other things being equal. Okay? So if I want to study the price of bread, if you do in general equilibrium, you have to put all the equation, also the prices of not just substitutes or complements, but even prices of things that nothing have to do with bread. But that's what general equilibrium requires. Everything is connected. So Marcia said this is not working. We should try to break complex problem in a sizable manner. And to do so, we have to assume that certain things are less important than the other. And therefore, we do something which is, I think, very important. We try to explain causes. If everything is determined by everything else, how do you find the special causes? Everything depends on everything, and so there is no causal analysis. I think one of the merits of Marshall had been precisely that. Method that was taken over by Keynes, by the way. The idea that let's assume we are in a short period. We will discuss what short period means in a minute, but for those of you who've done economics, traditionally, the short period means capacity is given. You're just interested in what happens, assuming that capacity is given. If you want to know what happens in the daily production, you assume that you're not dealing with the change in the plants, okay? If you want to know what determines the quantity of shoes that are produced daily, you're not interested in taking what's happened to the capacity. Your shoe capacity is given. Of course, if you want to discuss what are the projection in 10 years' time, long period analysis, then of course you cannot assume capacity is given and you have to assume that you can change capacity. What Marshall had taught us is to address problem with short period and long period by meaning by that you can take certain things constant for the purpose of the exercise you're doing, which is related to the short period. And this is done with partial equilibrium analysis. This has also been criticized by saying, how do you know what remains constant and what not? You're making a theoretical decision that might be wrong and so forth, but okay. So that's the notion, other things being equal, the idea that you can keep things constant and because you're looking for those factors which are very important to explain the events that you are studying. So you change the perspective from a sort of everything determines everything else on concentrated on the thing that you think are important to explain that particular phenomenon. And this is called general partial equilibrium accord. And then, as I already mentioned, is the time dimension, okay? And his typical example that he said, okay, if we take, the daily exchange, then of course the supply is given. But then if we take, say, a period of time in which supply can adjust it because people in the market realize that this thing is demanded, is in high demand, so they have the ability to produce more, but that's required time. In a day, in the fish market daily, you cannot change the quantity of fish. But if you take the idea that some guy realized the tuna fish is more in demand than some other fish, then of course there will be some adjustment in the production. People will try to get more tuna rather than other fish. And then even in the long period, then people may have more boats. And then, so he has this idea that the adjustment of supply to demand requires times, and these times show itself by the kind of adjustment that can be made. In the short period, you cannot adjust production, assuming that you have a huge demand of shoes for the day. Well, you cannot build up a factory for the next day, all right? So that's the way in which he thinks. He thinks that time is important consideration when we look at the adjustment of supply to demand. In general speaking, when we look at the working of a capital system, we have to take in role. And on the other hand, we have to take change into consideration. Change, not virtual change, actual change. Remember the biology example I was giving you? So we have to observe society, firms, individual as evolving creature. They change on the basis of the kind of stimulus they get, on the basis of competition they got, exactly like animals, like living beings. There is something that needs to be. So change means here transformation within the society, within the economic activity. And this transformation should be the object of analysis. So here the notion of change and time brings you back to reality and try to get a sense of what's going on in reality. And then you can use because he used standard neoclassic analysis, but this is not the only thing. His analysis is embedded in this notion of change, evolution, and study of single example of, as I said, he went around to factories. He wanted to know how the production process worked. And so he incorporated this in his analysis. So the two key words for Marshall economics is evolution and change. Evolution and change, taken from the biology thing. Okay, so like Adam Smith, I would say, Marshall laboratory was the real word. He illustrated a lot of these examples, like Adam Smith did. Things that you don't find in standard neoclassical economics. Yeah, they might give you an example, but most of these examples are so, Red Cross parcels, the exchange, or, the Robinson Crusoe in the island. All these examples that you find in standard micro courses, they are not real examples. They are, I don't know. Have you ever found any actual example? You find Red Cross parcels, you find Robinson Crusoe, you find all this kind of, sort of cartoon example, as I said. While in Marshall and Smith, you find actual description of events, which I found much, much more interesting. Okay. He was, well, by the way, Marshall, he was one of the inventor of something that I think has been used also in India, the notion of districts. Why certain group of firms tend to concentrate in a particular area and how they benefit by being close to each other. And that comes from his analysis again. He observed the fact that there is this organization that evolves on the basis of differentiation and specialization. Again, you see the idea that you look at the change and transformation to understand what's going on. And he was the inventor of the notion of districts, to understand why, for instance, in Italy, the shoe district was located in that particular area of Italy. Why? Or the textile people, why do they concentrate around that area? And so he came up with the idea that there were certain type of institution, there were family linkages, so it comes up with an explanation that looks at how, this situation transform over time. And I think I think that this notion of district was used everywhere. I gather it's done also in India, right? You have the explanation might be different, but the approach is the same. Try to understand why certain things evolve in a particular way, what makes transformation go in one direction rather than another. And I think he was the one who did that. And he thought that more than capital, what should be central in the analysis was the notion of organization. Function within the firm, within the productive system, within the industry or international. So he thought that understanding organization, how the productive system is interlinked, is one way to get the feeling of what was going to change and how the transformation, where the transformation would lead that particular production to one thing or another. So in this sense, I think it was pioneering much of the analysis that came afterwards with this location of firms outside or conglomeration and things like that. So he was looking at organization, and organization for him was also the outcome of history. Why people, the way in which they organize themselves might reflect their customs. They might reflect their historical past. They might reflect their being exposed to one particular political situation and so forth. So you see, you get a much richer story of motivations so I think that's why Marshall is so interesting, because it gives you some tools of analysis. He has already supply and demand, he has all these neoclassical tools, but he has also much more. And from Marshall, he developed theory of district developed. From Marshall, also the idea of the kind of economics which is called experimental economics developed, because the idea that the mind, it can be trained to, to make decision based on certain activity or experimental economics. And so there are various development of future economic thinking that I think were rooted in the approach that Marshall suggested. That's why I think he's an interesting author, even if what you think he has is only supply and demand. But that's not true. That's not true. That's not the only thing that you get from him. Okay, so let's look a little bit better to this time period analysis and this notion of equilibrium that he developed in a much more sophisticated way, and I think is still important today. So he distinguished between temporary equilibrium, and the normal equilibrium between demand and supply. To Marshall, market values, the prices that you observe in reality, are determined by the influences, what he called the accident of the moment, while normal values should be attained if the relevant economic condition could be left to work undisturbed their full effect. So he's introducing here a notion between market value and normal value, which seems to be similar to the classical one, okay? Remember Adam Smith, the accident of the moment is the death of a king. This is something, something accidental to that particular time. But is that the basis to understand what the price of cloth is going to be? No, he said, because we need to find the long. Marshall is using apparently the same methodology. He said, well, we cannot judge the determination of prices only on the basis of something happen in a moment. We have to know the laws. And how does he found the laws? He said, well, it depends how long the time we give to the forces to work their way out. But the forces are supply and demand. It's just that they might need more time to adjust. The equilibrium, so, is related, characterization related to time. If the supply side, remember what I said about the tuna fish thing, if you don't give enough time to the people to be able to adjust their boats to the quantity necessary to catch the tune, then of course you won't reach equilibrium of that price because you have not given enough time to the force to work themselves out. But if you have enough time, if you give enough time and these forces are left undisturbed, if there is a thunderstorm that destroy the boats, then of course the forces will not be able to work their way out. So he's arguing, if we have these market forces, we are able to work their way out, we will get in the long run to an equilibrium position. But unfortunately, there might be circumstances that prevent these forces to work out. And that's why we will not be in equilibrium. So it's not changing the explanation of the forces. It's just saying the time element might be a disturbing element, might be, because in reality, unlike the supply and demand of the neoclassical type, these are thought of working in real time. So the adjustment of supply is not just moving along a curve, it means the time required to make this adjustment possible. Is that clear? That what makes him so interesting? So while on a market day, he said, supply appears as a stock of goods already produced, and in the short period, we have a constraint of productive capacity. We cannot change the capacity in one day. But if we leave enough time, the producer realizes that it's worthwhile to increase capacity to meet the increase in demand. And if everything goes all right, we will have a proper adjustment and we will get a long period equilibrium. So the long period is a span of time long enough to productive capacity to be modified in response to profit expectation. And this is the important word I would like to remember, permanent variation in demand. So let's do this exercise. Suppose I'm a shoe producer. I have a factory producing shoes. And then I observe an enormous increase in the demand of this particular type of shoes. In the short period, I cannot do anything. Okay, supply is given, and I might raise a little bit prices, but that's the most I can do. Okay. Then I may decide, next step, well, let's increase the number of hours my plant is running rather than 8 hours a day. Let's run them for 12 hours a day or whatever. And let's see if this is, assuming that this is not enough, would I be prepared to enlarge my plant and, buy new machine and so on? This decision depends crucially on one thing. Do I believe that this change in demand is temporary or permanent? And this is something that Marshall make us think. And this is something that Keynes picked it up. The idea that the level of employment is determined by the expectations of demand at the aggregate level. And so this is what Marshall is telling us. If I don't expect my increase in demand to be permanent, but to be just temporary, I will not bother to buy to increase the productive capacity. So that's where the role of expectation comes in. Whether I expect something to be permanent or not. And that's how expectation gets into the analysis. And that's where Keynes picked it up. Keynes was a student of Marshall. That's where I think. And so if you expect demand not to be permanent, you may be stuck in the short period forever. You see why? You see why? If I expect that this increase in demand is not permanent, I don't increase productive capacity, I don't increase employment, and I remain stuck in that position forever because it is the expectation that demand is going to remain high that would induce me to increase investment. And this is the general theory. This is Keynes, that the level of employment depends on the level of expectation by entrepreneur who will make decision whether or not to increase production or reduce employment. You want to ask something?
But can any demand be a permanent? I mean,
well, permanent enough to
yeah.
justify the increase in capacity.
I mean, soon there will be an alternative of it, and that then the demand
Well,
will.
for instance, this fashion, nowadays everybody likes Nike or I don't know the names of things, Puma, whatever, and it's very fashionable and everybody Puma. How long does it last? How long? Who knows? But this entrepreneur has to make the decision whether or not to increase production of that particular line. And by permanent, meaning that I consider to be long enough this fashion to justify my investment in that particular line. And it might be wrong. It might go bankrupt. Because next day people find that they don't like the line and all. And this is what capitalism is about, But what I would like you to get as a message, that this idea that the expectation of future level of demand that drives investment decisions, and this might be wrong or right, but you may be stuck in a situation in which entrepreneurs do not believe in that. And this is exactly Keynes, and it comes from Marshall. Okay, now, we said that if the forces are such that they can remain unaffected by external events, then prices will get to their normal values. I use the word normal values also for the classical. Are these two values the same? That's what I would dispute. Marshall wanted to use the same word to show continuity of the classical theory to the neoclassical theory, but that's not continuity because for him, the normal values are determined by supply and demand, while for the classical theory, the normal value are determined by the equalization of the rate of profit. So even the word is the same, conceptually, the background of the analysis is completely different. So let me read out what he said about normal value. In each situation, price is governed by the relationship between demand and supply. As regard market prices, supply is taken to mean the stock of the commodity in question, which is on hand, or at all events in sight, is the market day. Okay? As regard normal prices, when the term normal is taken to relate to short period of a few months of a year, supply means broadly what can be produced for the price in question with the existing stock of plants, personal and impersonal, in a given time. Okay? So I was suggesting lengthening the number of hours the plant is. You're not changing the capacity, you're not changing, you try to, to exploit the existing capacity to its maximum. As regard normal prices, when the term normal refers to long periods of several years, supply means what can be produced by plant, which itself can be remuneratively produced and applied with a given time. So then long period means when you change the level of capacity. And this is what you find in your textbook. What is a short period? Capacity is given. What is long period? It seems trivial. I mean, short means short, and long means long. What is inspiring in this definition? But when you link it to this idea of capacity and to expectation, then it becomes a much more richer concept. Of course, long requires more time than short. This is not the thing. The thing is, what is meaning by saying in the short period the capacity is given? It's given that you cannot change things in a short time. You have to adjust to whatever is available. And you see, time becomes very important here. It's not timeless economy here. This is an economy in which it is recognized that to do things, you have to do it in real time. And that's what I think Marshall is teaching. So the crucial element is the period of time which is allowed to forces of demand and supply to bring themselves into equilibrium with each other. This is neoclassical theory, right? It's supply and demand again. But now the supply and demand curve are seen much more like forces that work their way in time. We are not moving along a given demand and a given supply. You trust to introduce this element of change of time, so making the analysis much more interesting and much richer. You might disagree. You might not like this idea of supply and demand, but this kind of supply and demand analysis has much more richer content than the one we usually given when you do the standard annual class. So what Marshall did very ably, he said, well, what I'm doing, I'm just bridging together the classical analysis and neoclassical analysis by showing that normal and natural, because the classical calling are the same. And what do they are characterized by? The notion of persistence. It's the persistence that is at the center of the analysis. I want to understand the laws, the same as Marx, the law that govern the system. They must be persistent law, not just fluctuation, something accidental. What are the forces behind what I observe in the prices determination and distribution and so on? So I'm looking for the persistence of these laws. And of course, the two theories have a different notion because for Marshall, normal and supply and demand applies to the short, to the long period, and to the market period. Why for the classical economists, there were two different laws. Market value, supply and demand, not schedule, but quantity. But in the long period, is the equalization with the rate of profit. There's no supply and demand. So you see, they're both looking for persistence, but the way they which figure out how this persistence is reached is very different. Okay, so what I found extremely fascinating in Marshall, and that's why I like the way in which he approached the matter, is that this distinction between short and long period is not as trivial as we find it in a textbook. The short is short, the long is long. It's the nature of the decision involved that matters. And so again, we are looking at entrepreneur, at decision makers who have expectation, who has uncertainty, who try to make out what to do. Is not an optimizing abstract agent. It's someone who has to make assessment of the reality and has to decide, is this demand going to be permanent? Is it something? So we have a feeling that we are getting in a much more interesting representation of what determines employment, what determines production. The so-called Keynes animal spirits, what drives a particular type of society to become more entrepreneurial than others? How the institutions are important in setting the scene for this entrepreneur to be optimistic. Why entrepreneurs should be more optimistic than less optimistic? Meaning have better expectation about the future of demand and so on. It depends possibly also in the environment in which they are. And so that kind of analysis makes, I think, the approach really worth investigating, because we want to understand what's going on in the decision-making mechanism, which is not just optimizing something under constraint. We want to bring all that matters because capitalism is driven by investment decision. And we want to know what drives them, what are in the mind of this entrepreneur who may decide or not to do something, and how to make them do things. What are the incentives and so forth. So I think this is what Marshall had taught us also, is that this decision-making thing depends on the time horizon in which you are applying this decision, and whether this is usually we'd say that there are particular type of decisions that are short-sighted. You cannot, and this is something that Keynes will tell us repeatedly, there is no way that we can know whether there will be something in 30 years' time. And then we have to make decision on think of the climate change situation. You know, it's something that we have to make decision because the time horizon we have to bear in mind is much longer than our lifetime. And so that kind of decision making has a different nature of a decision making that happens in your lifetime or even in your short working time, okay? So I think that this is a way to look in at the matter, which I found interesting in Marshall and should be. The take-home thing is that economic theory can take as constant those factors over which decision can be postponed. So I can take as given productive capacity because I can postpone this decision. I don't have to take it immediately. I have time to do something else. And take them as variable when describing situation in which they are a matter of decision by economic agents. So now we have a decision-making mechanism which becoming more interesting, more complex. Is not reduced to the kind of microeconomics textbook type that we are taught. It's still neoclassical, but he has a richness in it. And that's my message, you know. We need to learn neoclassical economics. Better if we learn it in the best author rather than in the, because it is important that, first of all, that we know what, but there are things that we might learn from neoclassical economics once they are adapted. I remember you made that interesting question, you know, modeling is also done by non-neoclassical people. But we learn modeling by the way in which neoclassical people do it, right? So that's the point of studying neoclassical economics. Otherwise, why would you bother? Why would you bother take a PhD, which is only on neoclassical? I encourage you to do so. But it is important to have also a corrective mind. And what is that's why history of economics thought might be important. Because it gives you an idea that there are alternative routes, that there are ideas that have not managed to become, accepted, but they are there and can be, you can come back to them and try to work your way out of them. So that's what I think is important. To learn neoclassical economics because it's the only game in town and you don't have much choice. But at the same time, try to get some correction in your way of thinking by saying, well, it doesn't have to be all like that. There might be other venues that I can follow up by using ideas that are not popular, but they were formulated and might be used in my analysis, okay? And then there is another thing which I found Marshall very convincing. What I call it, we call it conformative behavior. What is a conformative behavior? When there are situations that allow you to behave in such a way that you make that situation effective. Let me give you an example. Assume that you have an expectation that the price of copper tomorrow rises. And so you expect that you're going to make a profit if you buy, just making a stupid example, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so if you are a dealer in copper, what would you do? You rush to buy copper and copper price rises. So your expectation is confirmed. But it's confirmed because you acted in that particular way. If everybody, it's like a stock exchange with, with this algorithm. If everybody expects the price, they will rush to buy it and the price will rise. It would have not risen had not you behave in that particular way. And that's what is called conformative behavior. And that's something, again, Marshall taught us to think about it. You know, supply and demand sometimes are the result of a behavior which has been induced by the fact that individuals behave on the basis of that expectation. So given their knowledge of the environment and the routines, because what Marshall said about the district and he said about other things, you know, routines are very important in economics. You know, people do not invent each time how to behave in certain circumstances. They have a routine that would be followed. And so if they follow that routine, and if they don't expect anything to change, they behave in such a way that the expectations are confirmed. You know? So I live in a situation, I am a merchant in a particular set of a field. I know the way in which the business is run. I don't expect anything to change. And so I behave in such a way that nothing changes. Because I conform, the expectations are confirmed on my behavior. And where do these expectations come from? Knowledge, custom, routines. Might not be rationality at all. Might just be the way things have been done and people just follow. That's what Keynes picked it up again with the notion of conventions. You know, since I don't know the future, I behave assuming that the future will be like the past. I don't change anything and I continue to behave in a such way because I don't have any clue what's going to be. If I don't know what the future is like, the best thing I can do is to think it's going to remain the same, to remain what I know. And so this is another thing that I think came from Marshall. And so the important point, I think, that we can get for this analysis is that it is confirmative behavior that explains equilibrium, not because agents behave as predicted by the theory, but because, and this is something that was very typical in the rational expectation models for those of you who have done that kind of economics. People know, you know, the way in which the system works, and so they behave in a way that make the system work precisely in that way. You know, I'm not buying entirely the story, but there is something, this conformative behavior, especially when you explain things on the basis of routines, of habits, of customs, that is really interesting. So where do these expectations comes from? We have to know where do they come from. Individual assessment of the circumstances, but these circumstances are an environment varies. The same individual placed in a different set of circumstances in a different social environment by behaving in a different way. So we need to know the social embeddedness of this individual in order to be able to understand how he will behave in one circumstances or another. He said, well, expectations are individual based, each one of us. But individuals are not isolated figures. They live in a situation in which they share views of their fellow countrymen or fellow people engaged in the similar trade and so on. So we are talking a situation which might not be optimal. People behave because they belong to that particular caste, they belong to that particular class, because they belong to that particular region. Their behavior might not be optimal at all because it's just the outcome of this set of circumstances. But that's what we need to know in order to explain how their expectation, how do you change their expectation if you want to make them behave in a different way. So Marshall is not certainly making a point that individual have perfect knowledge, perfect foresight, something that we assume in neoclassical economics. I know all the available options, and then I make decisions. You make things by twists and turns, but you will get to equilibrium at one point. But assuming that this will happen in a sort of, you know, trial and error method, as it were. So people will adjust to the situation, they will, but the system is embedded, and this is what is faith, is embedded in the ability to make the equilibrium function if the market forces are left to work. The fact is that he felt that individual might not be identical. As a matter of fact, they are different. But in the end, there is the faith that these forces will get you to a situation. And the proof is that the system is working. You don't see disruption in prices around. You don't see, you see a smooth working of the market mechanism. So it means that in the end, with these twists and turns, the equilibrium can be reached. Okay? So I would like to have 10 minutes to discuss these matters rather than start on Rafa, which I may, but I think it's much better if we make sure that we have enough time to question and answer for that. So do you like Marsha? Did I make you like him or not? Better than the other neoclassical people, right? Do we have any question from the... No. You want me to start a new topic or? I think we want to stop at 15 past, right? That we want to stop
The
at...
time is 5:30. You can go.
Sorry?
Actually the time is 5:30 stipulated time. If you want to go, you could go till 5:30.
Yeah, but you see, what worries me is that if I give you too much, then you won't be able to process it. That's why I would like to have a little bit of discussion going on. Because if you get too much, I'm not sure you will be able to process it. But I might be wrong. You might be so good that you can give you anything and you digest quickly. I'd rather check it with you by having questions raised, especially for those who are outside, but they don't seem to have any. Do they? No, I don't see any hands. Okay.
On the distinction between long period and short period, which Marshall lays out, how does he define the long period? Does he use the idea of the capacity that
It's fully adjusted.
that the capitalist is planning to install, the time it takes to depreciate the new capacity that he's planning to install? Is that the idea he takes for the long period?
Yeah. The idea of the long period is that the capacity fully adjusted to the level of demand. Fully adjusted means that you don't have more, that you have made that decision to enlarge capacity in the long run because you have assumed that demand is remain high enough, okay? Demand is remain high enough to justify you increasing capacity. You may be wrong. It doesn't say that, it just says that capacity will be enlarged only when demand is perceived to last. And so when capacity is being enlarged, you may discover that you have overcapacity. There's no reason why you should be right. It's just that what is interested is in the adjustment mechanism that leads individual to make decisions that would lead to a long period solution. You see what I mean? In other words, is interested to distinguish decision making, which is based on short period, and decision making is based on a long period. In the short period, the problem does not arise because you're not changing capacity, right? The only thing you can do is change the level of utilization of that capacity. If you take the plant working 10 hours more or something. So the long period is characterized by the fact that you have adjusted capacity. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you discover that you have an overcapacity and then you have to do something about it. The problem is that with the excess capacity, it's very difficult to reduce it. Whether with the level of utilization of capacity, you can do that easily. You start by increasing the number of hours and then the next month you reduce the number of hours. But if you're stuck with the plants which is underutilized, what do? Nothing, you're stuck. And so that's the reversibility problem that gets a little bit difficult. How reversible are certain decisions? that involve, Marx has this idea that capitalism works by distractions, and Bashar doesn't have that. The idea that capitalism works by crisis, distraction. That's the way in which things are adjusted. By crisis, distraction, falling the rate of profit, all this mess. Marshall vision is not like that, obviously. It's things that, one way, there will be some that will go bankrupt, but someone will benefit by this. And so the system is an optimistic vision of the capitalist system, has been able to produce equilibrium situation. Yes?
Yeah. I find this discussion on expectations in Marshall very, very fascinating. One, I did not know that he wrote so much on expectations. But anyways, here it is presented as if expectations are formed through customs and practices. And yet Marshall is somebody, I mean, the logical endpoint of his theory is that, all markets are in equilibrium in some sense and there's full employment in the economy. Now, so when expectations are formed on basis of customs and practices, by taking history as our standard from which we form our expectations, it makes no sense to always end up in a point where you reach full employment, right? If the history tells me that, market is not doing well, etc., then I would act in a way where I would assume that market won't do well for the next day or the next period, whatever. The only way that you would end up in full employment by having expectations of this sort is if your agents are rational. If they know that, okay, I have this information with me and the system would function in this way, and therefore I conform to that rational way of how the system functions. Without rational expectations, I do not know how Marshall, who has spoken so much about expectations, cannot understand how the system does not necessarily need to full employment all the time. I mean, if it is really customs and practices that form expectations, it's pretty obvious that unemployment is, it could exist in general.
Well, I see your point, and I think it's a good point. But I'm not sure that I would frame it in this way. Why? I mean, one thing is trying to explain expectations, okay? And as you said, he's insisting on custom habits and so on. But then he also insists on performativity, okay? So people, in the end, this supply and demand adjustment mechanism is assumed to work because people, in the end, will conform. I'm not sure whether I would use the word rational. They will conform. They will try to. So the system, I mean, some people might get it wrong. This guy who made the wrong expectation, built it, but some other guy would take advantage of this guy having gone bankrupt, and he might buy that plant and so forth. So the idea is that it is inbuilt in the system, not individually, but in the system, the capacity to redress situation on the basis of the fact that there is some profit to be made in the situation, and this situation are not left unattended. So I would not say that you require rationality. You require the idea that the market mechanism is dynamic enough, like a biological system, that some species might get it badly, but some people would benefit from it. And so some others, individual, will benefit and the system will work in another way. He has very strongly this similarity with biology. So the system might not get all the time in full employment, but there are always forces that will make sure that those who got it wrong or things that got bad, they will, get out of the system and somebody else will come in and do that. So if we present it in a way that is, I don't think that the rationality does it. It's the evolution, the change, the mechanism is the tree of the forest. the example, the forest, there is a big fire, and then the fire make possible for other plants to grow, and the best and the fittest will grow higher than the others. That's the idea of the system as such. It's not the idea that the system will work at full employment all the time. The idea that full employment is reachable because the mechanism is such that eventually some things will go wrong, but something will go right. That's the way in which I see it, the way in which he envisaged the situation. Come on, don't be shy. Some other question. I cannot believe that everything is clear. Cannot be. Even if I'm a great teacher, obviously the matter is very complicated, it's difficult. There are things that you don't know. So please come on, ask me to clarify. Oh, there's somebody who wants to clarify. Okay.
Hi,
Yes?
Professor. Thank you for the lecture. I had a question from the slide where you talked about the principles, and
Yes.
I think you mentioned that he doesn't believe that like methods in economics are advanced. I was wondering if like he thinks this is like a position he's taking at the time. Does he like foresee that with more advancement it can be treated more as like a natural science? Or doesn't see that it can advance in the same way that method can advance in natural sciences?
I think that he didn't take, he take Darwin and Spencer theory very, very seriously. He studied very seriously Darwin and Spencer and the evolutionary theory in biology and science like that. So he thought not physical science. He didn't believe that economics should take physical science as a model because individual have decision, motivation, and things that obviously stars and planets and do not have. While in biology, he felt that there was a lot of similarity, especially in the way in which certain species survives, how species adapt. That's what was important to him. Our adaptation and evolution. So he was very much interested to see the situation as a system rather than a single individual. And also he placed individual in very specific environment. So if you want to know how a merchant will make decision, you have to know the nature of his trade, you have to know how the practice of his trade are done and so forth. Exactly the same thing that, biology would study a particular species, would study a particular type of birds or particular type of. So I think the example that he was looking at was biology, the type of biology that was developing at the time, namely Darwinian and Spencer biology. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking like in general, it feels like he's like, it's sort of, I don't know if this is how it like his, I know like use of his theory progressed, but it's sort of like a call for like further developing of methods until they reach this level of advanced ability to like make determinations empirically. Is that where he's going? Like he's saying at the time economics does not have the tools to be in the same like use as like a hard science. Like is it like it's an intermediate for him like position of where economics was at the time, or doesn't see it in general as having like the capacity to graduate into like an empirical science?
Yeah.
I mean like a hard science.
Well, I don't know what you mean graduating in art science. It means to get more mathematics into it. He had all the mathematics that was available at the time because he was first ranked, meaning in the Cambridge tripos in mathematics. He came up as the second or first or something. So he had all the mathematical tools. He just didn't believe that,
Okay.
he didn't believe that the model should be the physical sciences because he felt that you have to deal in economics with motivations, with aspiration, expectations, history. And this, exactly like in biology, if you want to understand why a species behave the way it does, you have to take into you cannot treat the behavior of an animal as you would treat the behavior of a stone falling in the ground or follow gravity or so on. So graduated towards science, I don't think he would never believe that that means to become like physics. I think he wanted to graduate it to become like biology. With the advance that he had at the time. It was not lack of mathematical sophistication, not at all, because Marshall was a fully trained mathematician. With the mathematics he had at the time, of course. He didn't have quantum mechanics, obviously, but I don't see that any progress is made in economics by using more maths, honestly. As a matter of fact, I consider to be a regressive factor. Because people believe that because they have more maths, they have more understanding of what's going on. And it seems to me that what we have reached is to have less understanding because we put too much emphasis in the maths rather than in the substance of what we want to explain. That's my view, because I'm also ignorant in mathematics.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I'm wondering with the notion of the district and institutions and environment, is there any implicit or explicit acceptance of increasing scale? Because if you have of increasing scale.
Oh yes, of course, because like in the biology example, why do certain species manage to do better than others? Because they develop skills for survival better than others. And I think that in the district case, what he said, that the reason why district develop very well, because the firm managed to increase their skill, their capacity, and so forth.
No, I mean increasing scale.
Scale of
production.
Yeah, skills. I mean, it's like the factory, the pin factory of Adam Smith, if you are able to do the same thing rather than all the process, you become more skillful in doing that particular thing. And the district certainly shows that people learn from each other. And so they improve their skills. Oh, certainly.
I think there's some increasing returns to scale.
Skills.
Scale. I thought you said skill. No, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes scale is good, sometimes it's not. There is an optimum scale in any type of production. So certainly, as Adam Smith taught us, if you don't have enough scale in the kind of production, you might not reach a market in a satisfactory way. So scale is important. But for instance, we have example in which small is beautiful. Certain type of activity improved by being small. So scale depends. It depends on whether scale helps you or not to improve the situation.
No, I'm saying that with regards to standard neoclassical arguments about constant returns to scale, is there any implicit sort of...
No, there's nothing to do with that. Constant return to scale or constant has to do with the fact that if you double the input, you will double exactly the output, but that I don't see any reference to that in the district. I thought you said skill, so I said yes. No, and the district are made up of small firms. They're all small. It's the alternative to the big firm. So scale it seems to be better to have some small firm working close to another rather than have a big firm producing large scale. So I think it depends on the type of production. I don't think there are certain things that can be done at the small scale. There are type of production that require large scale, but not all of them. So no, nothing to do with the constant return to scale anyway. Yes?
I had a clarificatory question. So I was thinking the concept of expectation that Marshall explains. As I could understand, he is saying that even if economic agents, even if market do not work on the principle of equilibrium of supply and demand, but individual expectation is something expectation is that market should work on the principle of equilibrium, supply and demand. And in the same way, the individual also behave in a certain way, considering that maybe market is working at a equilibrium uh, principle. So I don't know what is is there any fundamental difference that he is creating with the neoclassical? Because I but, like, implicitly he's saying the same thing, that maybe or is there a if there any if see the difference between the Marshall, what is he's arguing, and the neoclassical is the difference is that neoclassical takes equilibrium principle as a given, and he's not taking equilibrium principle as a given, but rather saying that it is a individual actor who wants market to work on this principle, and that's why behave in a certain way.
No, it's not just a matter of wanting, it's also a matter of behavior, okay? So for the simple neoclassical story, the only thing that you need is to have an individual who maximizing its utility. Let's take only demand for the moment, forget about supply, okay? You only need an individual who is rational, who is maximizing his utility, given his budget constraint. That's the only assumption you need to assume that then the system will get to equilibrium, okay? Forget about supply now, assuming the supply is okay. What Marshall said, he said, well, first of all, individuals are not all rational agents. They may behave in a way that depends on their customs and things like that. So they might behave on the basis of some expectation they may or may not realize. On the whole, on the system, some expectation might be disappointed. But on the whole, the system will work in that way because any other behavior will be corrected. You see? So the idea is that you don't have to assume that everybody is rational, that everybody is maximizing. You have to assume that people behave the which they behave, they will adjust to the situation, and by trial and error, the system will work and we will get you to a general equilibrium. So it's a much more, less, as it were, simple-minded story. It wants to take into account that the system might require time to adjust, that not everything will happen as if everybody will maximizing happily, pursuing self-interest. But he has a faith by trial and error, and by convention and so on, the system will eventually get to equilibrium. Okay, so he's a neoclassical economics, so he believes in supply and demand. It's just the way in which you get there is much more, less straightforward and might get some people out of the equilibrium. But the important thing that the system is seen to have self-adjusting property, like an evolutionary system, that some people will adjust and some people not. Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, if there will be an equilibrium, then again there will be some contradictions happen, isn't it? Like,
equilibrium means supply and demand will be, but what happens if some exogenous factor happens?
there is, like, on one hand he's talking about the temporary and permanent vision and
Yeah.
binary, but on the other hand we are talking about change and evolution.
Yeah.
So that's it, there won't be any, like, it's a whole question of the biggest question that, but then there will be no permanence in that way.
Of
Yeah.
course, not
Yeah.
even the neoclassical economists believe that this is going to be there forever. It's just that they say the supply and demand forces are there, and that's what explains how prices are determined and how wages and profit are determined. That's what he'll say. Marshall is not denying this. He's just saying that these forces of demand and supply may take time to adjust, first of all, and what is behind those forces, they're the individual frame of mind by which some people may behave in a way that may not be conducive to that particular type of equilibrium, but the system as a whole has embedded mechanism by which, by evolution and change, you get some there, okay? Yeah, last question. Yes? No, somebody is having a, yeah, is this one? No, you can give the mic to him. Oh, you have the mic. Oh, I thought you wanted the mic. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of discussion on time in Marshall here. But even after all this discussion on time and how time plays a crucial role, etc., the conclusions that he has come up with do not differ in any way from the neoclassicals, largely. There's no crucial difference in any way.
Depending what you mean by crucial.
I mean, in the sense, distributive shares are still determined by
I'm not saying that Marshall is a neoclassical
relative,
economy,
yeah, relative.
but is more interesting than others. That's what I'm saying.
I mean, my question is, does time really matter to neoclassical theory? You introduce time, you do not have time in your theory, you end up with the same conclusions because your mathematical frame is such that, as long as you use continuous derivative functions, as long as you use anything that is twice differentiable, you will not need time. If you introduce time, it is only for the sake of a little exposition. To me, at least, I understand it that way. But so does time really matter for neoclassical theory?
No, the thing you see, I don't think that Marshall matters for neoclassical theory. It matters because for two reasons, to my mind. First of all, from Marshall, a lot of interesting development has risen, which I consider to be worth considering. I just mentioned the district. I couldn't mention experimental economics. I couldn't mention. So I think Marshall, from the point of view of the history of economic thought, is an interesting author because it has ideas that can be developed in a way which this is the reason. And secondly, because the way in which microeconomics has developed, general equilibrium, stochastic general equilibrium, I find it so uninteresting that I would like, if neoclassical economics needs to be taught, it's much better to be taught in the way in which Marshall envisages, because it gives room to other things that might be interesting to explore. So it doesn't, I never said that Marshall is not neoclassical. As a matter of fact, he is a neoclassical. But he's a type of neoclassical economics from which I can see, I can learn, I can have some insight in the working of the system. If I'm given the kind of microeconomics or general equilibrium, I don't honestly see any educational value in that kind of thing. And I also think that this short period method, by having causal short period chain, I think it's still useful, even when you do economics, to think in terms, not everything determines everything else, not having just the general equilibrium approach to things. Just try to get this chain, causal chain, a little bit shorter and concentrate on causal factor. That's why I think that it's useful to have Marshall in mind. But I agree with you. It doesn't make any difference, supply and demand and so forth. But the richness of the approach. And so if you have to learn neoclassical economics, much better to do it through Marshall than through these other guys. Okay? So it's 5:30. Drink time. Oh, there is somebody. Yes?
Hi,
yes?
Professor.
Hi.
Hi, I am asking this question on behalf of my classmate Shireen. They are unable to mute themselves, so I am going to read their question from the chat. It's a bit a long question.
A long question? Make it short.
I will read it. I will read it as it's on mine. It says, Marshall theory suggests that expectations are shaped collectively over time, yet behavioral economics reveals that cognitive biases often distort individual decision-making. With AI and machine learning increasingly influencing market expectations, do these technologies reinforce Marshall's view of collective expectation formation, or do they create fragmented markets where equilibrium is harder to attain due to algorithmic biases and individualized decision patterns? That's the question of my class.
Yeah, no, I think it's much worse because take the example of stock exchange market. This algorithm type of things is getting much more fluctuations and uncertainty in the outcomes. You see, Marshall believed that if you follow routines, that people form expectation of the basis of the knowledge of the situation, the system would be much more stable, much more with less fluctuation. That was his belief, which I think it was right. And now when, you know, you have in the stock exchange all this algorithm and so forth, the system become much more unstable. And I agree with you that, you know, by having all this algorithm type of decision making would make the system much more volatile. Certainly, the stock exchange is an example of that. And I think there are rumors or willingness, they want to stop this thing happening so much because it requires just a little bit of change in the prices. Everybody is using the algorithm to get into it, and the fluctuation becomes much larger. So yes, I agree. Okay, I think we have to stop now.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll see you tomorrow with these two great men, Rafa and Kane, and I hope you will enjoy that. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you.